Last time we spoke about the fall of Tinian and the Battle of San Sapor. Following the capture of Nome 4 and Biak, the Allies advanced to the Volga Peninsula, constructing vital air bases. MacArthur initially focused on seizing Sorong and Wagyu Island, but operations accelerated, making the Clemente oil fields non-viable. And oil rehabilitation projects in the Dutch East Indies were prioritized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. MacArthur planned reconnaissance in the Mar-San Sapor area. The 6th Division launched Operation Typhoon, and Task Force 77 executed landings on July 30th of 1944. Airfields were built, and patrols eliminated Japanese forces. Meanwhile, Tinian saw intense fighting, with Marines securing key objectives by July 31st. Following massive bombardments, Marines continued advancing, encountering heavy resistance, but eventually declaring Tinian secured on August 1st. Meanwhile, Guam operations saw similar advances, with coordinated attacks overcoming Japanese defenses. This episode is The Fall of Guam. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube, and on any podcast platform. Over there I'm actually releasing quite a long series of podcasts on numerous subjects touching upon World War II and the Pacific War. Some of these subjects are underrated moments of the Pacific War, World War II, military innovations of World War II, and a two-part series on Operation Overlord, specifically looking at the Canadian experience during the D-Day landings. Also, if you have a chance, why don't you check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what it will tackle next. Give it a look. This week, our podcast is bringing us back to the intense action in Guam. As we had previously observed in Guam, General Shepard's Marine Brigade had effectively captured the Oriout Peninsula, while General Turnge's 3rd Marine Division had reached the designated beach line, pushing back a weakened Japanese force retreating northwards. Meanwhile, General Bruce's 77th Division maintained control over the southern beachhead line, preparing for a general eastward assault. An engineer battalion began constructing a supply road towards Yona, a project that ultimately failed to support the infantry's advance. On July 30th, Turnge's Marines and infantrymen sent patrols to gauge the strength of the Japanese forces, but dense foliage obscured enemy movements. General Geiger eventually concluded that defensive positions were likely near the Agana Pago Bay road. He planned an initial advance towards the general line of Agana Pago Bay, followed by a northeastward attack. Turnge's Marines were assigned to capture the capital, Agana, the strategic Tinian airfield on the left, while Bruce's infantry aimed to secure Pago Bay over to the right. Following 2 days of intense artillery and naval bombardment, Geiger's offensive commenced at 6:30 a.m. on July 31st. On the left, Turnge's units encountered minimal resistance. The 3rd Marines, now led by Colonel James Stewart, quickly occupied the ruins of the abandoned Agana and moved beyond the 01 line to secure the main northbound road. The 21st Marines advanced through the dense underbrush, reaching the 01 line after neutralizing an enemy pillbox near Fanya. When Lieutenant Colonel Duplantis' 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines brought his command post forward, a curious incident occurred, which illustrated the confusion of the Japanese. Someone in the battalion command group cited one of the bypassed enemy groups, estimated to be about 15 to 20 men, led by an officer moving towards the new CP area. The Marines held their fire, and when the small unit got within 150 yards of the now waiting men, an interpreter called out to the Japanese to surrender. Apparently thinking they had finally reached friendly lines, they started forward, then stopped to hold a hurried conference. All the chattering was interrupted by the interpreter urging them forward, but by this time the aggregation had decided that they were in unfriendly territory. They broke and ran in all directions. The Marines opened fire, killing and wounding about half of them. Those still alive escaped into the protecting foliage. The 9th Marines destroyed a delaying detachment at Ordat and 2 tanks during their successful push to the O1 line. Colonel Hamilton's 1st and 3rd Battalions, along with Colonel Tensolo's 3rd Battalion, advanced to the right, moving through some steep slopes and narrow gorges in columns. They successfully reached Yona and the Pago River without encountering any opposition. With the reconnaissance troop now protecting the southern flank, General Bruce's 77th Infantry Division started towards the east coast of Guam at 7 a.m. on July 31st. Elements of the 307th with the 3rd Battalion 305th attached led the way in a column of battalions. Lack of enemy resistance permitted battalions to move with companies and columns, yet even so, the march proved most difficult. The troops initially scaled steep slopes, slid down into narrow gorges, and followed along the foothills southwest of the central mountain range of Guam. For a time, vehicles followed, but soon the terrain became too rough that even jeeps could not traverse it, as one infantryman would later write. The distance across the island is not far, as the crow flies, but unluckily we can't fly. The nearest I came to flying was while descending the slippery side of a mountain, in a sitting position. After advancing a few yards, you find that the bolt handle of a machine gun on your shoulder, your pack and shovel, canteen's knife, and machete all stick out at the right angles, and are as tenacious in their grip on the surrounding underbrush as a dozen grappling hooks. The flies and mosquitoes have discovered your route of march and have called up all the reinforcements, including the underfed and undernourished, who regard us as nothing but walking blood banks. We continue to push on. During this movement, Hamilton's Company L liberated 2,000 Guamanians from a concentration camp near Tinian. Soldiers willingly gave their rations and cigarettes to the undernourished men and women, who were almost overcome with joy at once at seeing Americans. Men of the 77th Division soon forgot the long, tiresome cross-island march as the full realization of the expression, liberation of enslaved peoples, came to the troops. Following the Arati operations, Shepard's brigade was ordered to take over the southern half of the beachhead line from Inalas to Macabo Point, relieving the 305th and 306th regiments. On August 1st, Geiger's northward push continued, with the 305th moving to the Yona area and the 306th heading to Pago Bay. The 305th and 307th regiments advanced slowly through the rough terrain without any opposition, reaching the O2 line by nightfall. On the left, Turnage began his advance with 3 regiments abreast, but the 3rd and 9th Marines eventually pinched out the 21st upon reaching the intermediate 2DA line. At 3 p.m., these 2 regiments resumed their advance against slight resistance and they reached the O2 line by nightfall. The main challenge during this period was moving supplies forward, as both divisions relied on the same coastal road heavily mined by the Japanese. With the rapid advance came the necessity to move supply distribution points closer to the front. Trucks began to roll over the already crowded coastal highway to establish an advanced division dump in the Agana Central Plaza area. Artillery units started to displace forward so that continuous direct support would be available to the assault units. This added traffic, plus the fact the 77th Division would have to move supplies over the same road, presenting a problem to the engineers. In an effort to alleviate the situation, the 25th Naval Construction Battalion and the 19th Marines put all available men to work improving existing roads and trails. Yet despite these efforts, by August 1st, the problem of getting supplies forward was becoming much more serious. The main coastal road, and the only one that ran from west to east on northern Guam, over which all traffic had to move, had been heavily mined. The Japanese had placed aerial bombs and single-horn mines at road junctions and intersections in and around Agana. In addition to being mined and heavily congested, the 2-lane, hard-surfaced Agana-Pago Bay Road was overused, poorly maintained, and, with frequent rain, soon deteriorated badly. In the end, the engineers could not properly maintain the road and still allow the essential supply columns through. On the morning of August 2nd, artillery and warships bombed the new positions General Obata was trying to establish around Mount Santa Rosa. Meanwhile, the Marines and infantrymen continued their pursuit northwards, aiming to reach the O3 line behind Japanese delaying positions at Finagayan and Mount Barrigada. Over on the left, the 9th Marines swiftly captured the Tinian airfield, but their advance was hampered by a very dense jungle. Despite this, they managed to gain 1,800 yards, while the 21st Marines cleared the Saipan Point, Yapo Point area and small enemy groups. Over on the right, the 77th Division's advance was initially covered by a 14-tank patrol conducting reconnaissance in the Barrigada area when they faced heavy resistance. The 307th Regiment quickly secured Price Road, but Tanzola's 3rd Battalion was halted by concealed machine gun positions near the Barrigada Well. Subsequently, the 307th, now led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Manuel, was also stopped near a village, with Manuel's 1st and 3rd Battalions becoming mixed up just as an enemy tank broke through their lines. After numerous failed attempts to dislodge the enemy, Companies G and E managed to penetrate the Japanese lines in the afternoon, although Company G had to be evacuated by nightfall. Meanwhile, the 305th moved up to consolidate their lines with the 307th. Since Bruce's infantrymen failed to link up with the Marines, Colonel Butler's 2nd Battalion was sent to fill the gap between the divisions. Following a reorganization, the 305th and 307th Regiments attacked again the next morning, encountering surprisingly little resistance as they moved through Barrigada and secured the vital well there. The 77th Division had a special reason for wanting to reach Barrigada quickly. The reservoir and pump located 100 yards northwest of the road junction number 306 could supply 20,000 gallons of water per day to the troops. Until now, the men of the division had quenched their thirst by getting water from streams and creeks. But in the northern part of Guam, there were no streams, and the reservoir would be the only source of water. With tanks leading the way, Manuel's 3rd Battalion advanced quickly and reached the summit of Mount Barrigada, although the 2nd Battalion lagged behind them. Meanwhile, the 305th Regiment engaged in several isolated skirmishes but still managed to link up with the 307th. Over to the left, Turnage had also resumed his advance towards the 03 line. The 3rd Marines encountered little resistance and they reached their objective successfully. Colonel Craig's 1st Battalion was halted by heavy fire near Finagayan after destroying a Japanese stronghold there. That night, the Marines faced motor and tank attacks, but the assaults made little progress. Meanwhile, as the 22nd Marines patrolled southern Guam, the 4th Regiment was held in reserve at Toto. On August the 4th, the remainder of Shepard's brigade began moving to Toto, leaving only Colonel Schneider's 1st Battalion and the 6th Defense Battalion behind. Following Turnage's orders, the 21st Marines were positioned between the other 2 regiments to reach the 03 near Dedido. At the same time, Craig's 1st Battalion made minimal gains towards Finagayan, while the rest of the 9th Marines advanced to the 03 line and successfully severed the Finagayan-Barrigada Road. Over to the right, Bruce's infantrymen followed an artillery barrage, advancing to the 03 line, overcoming terrain difficulties and securing the objective by nightfall. On the 5th of August, Turnage's 3 regiments continued their advance, pushing past the 03 line. The 3rd Marines reached Amante's Point, and Craig's 1st Battalion finally overran the remaining Japanese positions at Finagayan. Behind them, Shepard's brigade moved to Dedido, preparing to take over the left flank for the final push. Meanwhile, as the 306th Regiment relieved the exhausted 307th, Tanzola's men continued to fight through the dense jungle, with his 2nd Battalion reaching the 04 line by nightfall. During a Japanese nighttime raid, the 1st Battalion was targeted, resulting in 48 casualties. Following this, the 2nd Battalion encountered the tanks the next morning, eventually neutralizing them but suffering an additional 46 casualties. Bruce's regiments gathered at the 04 line to prepare for an attack against Mount Santa Rosa, where Obata had concentrated most of his forces. Turnage's regiments also resumed their attack, advancing with minimal resistance. Geiger initiated the final push on August the 7th, with Turnage's Marines facing minor obstacles due to the jungle terrain. Despite this, the 3rd Marine Division reached the 05 line by nightfall. Shepard's brigade swiftly progressed along the coast, joining forces with the 3rd Marines. Meanwhile, the 306th and 307th Regiments prepared for a coordinated attack. Bruce's strategy involved the 306th securing ground north of the Japanese defensive lines, the 307th leading a tank infantry assault against Yigo, and the 305th closing in on Mount Santa Rosa. Once each objective was secured, Santa Rosa would be encircled from Ano to Lumina Point, leaving the enemy with no escape route except into the sea. By midday, despite facing delays from the narrow road and enemy sniper activity, Manuel's tanks surged ahead of the infantry, veering right to swiftly eliminate several Japanese machine gun positions on the road's edge. However, their advance was halted by heavy Japanese fire from the left and the rear, as they crested a slight elevation. In a wedge formation commanded by Captain Seeger from his tank at the right rear, the light tanks swept rapidly over the slight crest. As he pushed on, there was an explosion to the left of the tanks, directly in front of Seeger. He radioed Colonel Stokes. "There's a burst in front of me. Could be a mine or anti-tank gun. Call for the mediums." Just before the mediums came up, more explosions sounded from the left. The tankers could not locate the source of the fire because of the dense woods to the left and the absence of any flash or smoke. When the mediums reached the open area, their crews could tell that the light tanks were in trouble, but they could not see where the fire was coming from. Only when they advanced up the slight rise and began themselves to have steel shrapnel and bullets smashed on the left side of their hulls and turrets did they turn and pour fire back into the woods. 50 yards behind the stricken tanks, the infantrymen struggled to push through the positions by the road, behind the stricken tanks that were overrunning them. The Japanese still fired from a pillbox that had been blasted by medium tanks as they raced ahead. The troops put rifle and machine gun fire straight into it. They threw 6 grenades before one landed inside the position. The enemy continued to fire from it. Then a flamethrower man maneuvered cautiously up to the position and he put searing flame in through the opening. The heat was too much for the defenders and one of them scurried out and he fell before American guns. The enemy position, so skillfully concealed from the front but vulnerable from the rear, was built around 2 light tanks. 2 anti-tank guns, both 20mm, and 6 light and 2 heavy machine guns, plus about a makeshift battalion of infantry, added their fire to make the Yugo defense quite formidable. One medium tank was hit in the gas tank, flame shot out from the bottom and quickly enveloped its sides. The crew hastily clambered out of it just before the ammunition inside began exploding. Another tank stalled under the heavy fire. As bullets hit the vehicle, the tankers dashed for the shell hole. Some of the mediums moved on out of the area. One of them tried to sweep around the right below the line of enemy fire and promptly threw a track. As more tanks came up, they swung their cannons and machine guns around for brief fire on the enemy positions to the left, and they passed on to the objective ahead. The leading light tank had similarly been destroyed, and another was destroyed shortly afterwards. The American armor suffered losses against this well-concealed enemy position. Fortunately, Colonel Smith's 3rd Battalion encountered minimal resistance in the jungle, directing Company K to flank the Japanese from the rear, catching them off guard and eliminating them without any casualties. This enabled the 307th to secure the Yugo area and the elevated terrain to the northeast in readiness for the Santa Rosa assault. Meanwhile, the 306th consolidated west and north of Yugo, while the 305th advanced to the Lamuna Point line. The day also witnessed the inaugural combat flights of the Marine planes from the newly completed Orote airfield over Guam. By nightfall, Obata had dispatched his remaining tanks on a futile infantry tank raid against the 306th, which repelled the attack successfully. On August the 8th, as the 305th and 307th regiments closed in on the Santa Rosa mountain, Smith's forces continued north towards Lulong to complete the encirclement. Although the 306th captured Lulong, the 307th encountered minimal resistance in capturing Santa Rosa. Subsequently, Bruce instructed Smith to push northwards towards Salisbury, but progress was limited by the day's end. Back over at the left flank, Shepard's brigade and Turnge's division continued their advance. The 22nd Marines progressed to Ritadian Point, establishing 3 roadblocks there. The 4th Marines secured the 05 line and advanced to RJ 462. The 21st Marines patrolled the Chaguan area, while the 3rd Marines fought through dense jungle to defeat a Japanese roadblock and reach the Salisbury-Tarage Road. Patrols returned late in the afternoon and reported few enemy contacts, but one such unit from the 3rd Battalion 21st Marines had discovered a Japanese truck containing the bodies of 30 native men who had been beheaded. According to the official account of the incident, the Guamanians, found near Chaguan, had not been dead more than 24 hours. The next morning, another patrol found an additional 21 bodies in the jungle near the same village. The 9th Marines faced heavy resistance as they dug in around Salisbury, close to Obata's headquarters. A tank infantry counterattack targeted Stewart's 2nd Battalion at night, dispersing the enemy but necessitating retreat due to the threat of Obata's remaining tanks. Stewart's 3rd Battalion and Butler's 1st Battalion attacked the next morning, but they found no sign of the tanks. Meanwhile, the 77th Division patrolled the Yugo-Salisbury area, and the 9th Marines advanced rapidly towards the northeastern coast before redirecting patrols to Savannah Grande, where 3,000 Japanese were suspected to be hiding. Following artillery bombardment, the Marines occupied Savannah Grande and Patti Point but found little evidence of Japanese presence. Patrols from the 4th and 22nd Marines also reached the northern beaches, leading Shepard to declare an end to organized resistance in the brigade zone. The last known resistance persisted in the 3rd Marine sector where Obata's tanks were last observed. Accordingly, on August the 10th, Stewart's 2nd Battalion initiated an attack to the east, establishing contact with 2 tanks on the road. Swiftly disabling these tanks, the Marines pressed forward, swiftly overpowering the Japanese positions and successfully seizing a total of 7 abandoned tanks. By 11:30, Geiger declared an end to organized resistance on Guam. American casualties up to this point totaled 1,214 killed, 5,704 wounded, and 329 missing, with 10,971 Japanese reported dead. Despite this announcement, Obata persisted at Mount Mutagak, fending off Bruce's infantry patrols since August the 8th. Finally, on August the 11th, Smith's 1st Battalion launched a meticulously planned attack, supported by tanks and mortar barrages, stunning the defenders and enabling the soldiers to destroy cave entrances. When the caves were reopened 4 days later, more than 60 bodies, including General Obata, were found inside the well-fortified command post. Following the battle, Major General Henry Larson's garrison forces maintained intensive patrols on Guam throughout the remainder of the year, under close scrutiny from Island Command. Island Command, Guam under General Larson, had taken command of the Orote Peninsula and the Cabras Island on August 2nd to begin base development, namely the airfield and seaport. It then assumed formal command of Guam on August 15th. Island Command grew rapidly as it took over all logistics, construction, and civil affairs in multiple stages. It included the 5th Naval Construction Brigade with the 27th to 29th CB regiments, with 12 CB, 4 Army, and 1 Marine Engineer Battalion plus Lion 6, a Navy Advanced Base Force responsible for building and operating naval operating bases. Island Command was also responsible for the care of 21,000 Guamanian civilians, and built replacement housing for over 15,000 of them. Both the 3rd and 77th Division maintained an infantry regiment and artillery battalion in the north to deal with any of the diehards. Up to 80 Japanese were killed each day during the first 2 weeks after Guam was declared secure. The nightmare would continue for the Japanese for some time to come. The 3rd Marine Division took over sole responsibility for island defense under Island Command on August 22nd. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade then departed for Guadalcanal on August 31st, where it would be expanded into the 6th Marine Division to fight on Okinawa. The 3rd Marine Division finally remained on the island to train for Iwo Jima, as did the 77th for Leyte and later Okinawa. An estimated 8,500 Japanese soldiers remained scattered in the jungles of the north and the mountains to the south, engaging in guerrilla warfare until the war's conclusion. However, most were either killed or captured before then. The final tally for Guam by August of 1945 included 18,377 Japanese killed, 1,250 captured, with the Americans losing a total of 1,407 killed, 6,010 wounded, and 367 missing. By the conclusion of the Marianas Campaign, the Japanese had suffered casualties exceeding 50,000, while the Americans solidified their control by positioning themselves strategically along the inner ring of the Imperial defenses. This positioning enabled them to cut off the flow of supply ships and submarines that had previously supported remote enemy garrisons. Additionally, the Americans established a naval base with the capacity to support 1/3 of the Pacific Fleet, set up with extensive forward supply depots, which posed a threat of swifter assaults on the Japanese home islands, and they constructed several B-29 airfields. These airfields facilitated the unleashing of devastating aerial bombardments against Japan, bringing the full force of total war to its people through a relentless barrage of explosives and fire. Now that finishes up the story of the Marianas, but we need to travel back over to New Guinea. Despite the initial success of the Japanese offensive, General Hall's forces successfully halted the enemy advance and reorganized their river line by July the 15th, although there remained a 1,500-yard gap in the center. Aware of this vulnerability in the American defenses, the Japanese exploited it, particularly under the cover of darkness. However, Colonel Starr's 3rd Battalion actively patrolled this area and occasionally engaged with the enemy, such as on the night of July the 14th, when they eliminated 135 Japanese soldiers. Nonetheless, General Cunningham reported that his South Force had expanded its lines nearly 1,000 yards beyond its designated sector, without encountering any elements of the 124th Regiment. Consequently, on July the 15th, Starr concluded that his regiment had not advanced as far south as previously thought, prompting him to order his units to adjust their positions southward to fortify their defenses along the Drinamo River towards Cunningham's Troop E location. The next morning, the 3rd Battalion began its journey southward to close the gap. However, upon reaching the area by nightfall, Troop E came under attack from 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 239th Regiment. As the cavalrymen sought cover from this assault, Starr's 3rd Battalion also faced fire from Colonel Nara's 3rd Battalion, which had redirected southward following its defeat at the Paup villages. This division split the American force, with Companies L and M encountering increasing resistance as they pressed southward towards the South Force lines, with Companies I and K fortifying their positions for the night. Despite the engagement resulting in the death of several Japanese soldiers and the narrowing of the gap to 500 yards, nightfall on the coast witnessed General Adachi's coastal attack force launching suicidal banzai charges towards Anamo, only to be swiftly repelled by the defenders' lethal machine gun fire, resulting in the complete annihilation of the force. In the rear, Colonel Howie's 1st and 2nd Batons were dispatched by Hall to eliminate remaining enemy units west of the Drunamore. Over the course of 2 days, in a series of complex and occasionally disjointed company maneuvers, the Americans successfully subdued Colonel Naro's remaining troops in the area. Meanwhile, further to the south, Japanese groups were spotted crossing the Drunamore at fording points approximately 2,500 yards south of Afua, prompting Cunningham to deploy Troop A to a strategic high ground behind the river in an attempt to halt the westward Japanese movements. There, the 78th and 80th Regiments, led by Major General Miyake Sadahiko, were gathering in preparation for a fresh assault. Adachi devised a fresh strategy, envisioning Miyake's forces striking Afua from the southern front, while the 239th Regiment prepared an advance against the Kawanakashima area. Furthermore, the retreating 237th Regiment and the reserve 66th Regiment received orders to head south to reinforce future assaults by the 20th Division, although they wouldn't reach the destination until July the 25th. Meanwhile, as the Miyake force gradually maneuvered into position on the right and rear of Cunningham's 1st Squadron, Starr faced ongoing challenges in filling the gap in the center, eventually managing to close it by the morning of July the 18th. That night, Miyake finally dispatched 2 battalions to launch an assault on the 1st Squadron's command post and the adjacent perimeter held by Troop A, successfully pushing them back 250 yards to the northeast. However, swift reinforcements enabled Cunningham to recapture the lost ground the following morning, prompting the enemy to retreat northwest into the jungle. By afternoon, fresh Japanese units had once again encircled Troop A's position, yet after an effective artillery barrage, the cavalrymen thwarted Adachi's plans by pushing 600 yards to the southwest. Following this triumph, on July the 21st, Troop C relieved the battered Troop A. Howie's battalion successfully established a patrol base on the east branch of the Coronel Creek. Starr's 2nd Battalion relocated to Palaroo to enhance outer security southwest of the airfield. Concurrently on July the 19th, the initial units of General Wing's 43rd Division commenced landing at Aitape, with the 2nd Battalion, 169th Regiment subsequently assuming control of approximately 1,000 yards of the river line on the right flank of the 124th Regiment by July the 22nd. Meanwhile, Adachi instructed the still organizing Miyake force to launch another assault on the Afua from the north and west, while General Nakai's 79th Regiment crossed the Drunamore River to strike from the south. On the 21st, during the evening, Miyake initiated an attack on Troop C's position, effectively isolating it from the remainder of the South force. Despite the cavalry's resistance against the intense Japanese onslaughts, Miyake's unit successfully thwarted Cunningham's efforts to relieve the besieged troops in the subsequent days. Faced with the threat to his command post and reluctant to divert more forces from the river defenses, Cunningham ultimately opted to establish a new defensive line 1,000 yards north of Afua, consequently abandoning the town and leaving Troop C stranded. It was not until the night of the 21st of July that the Japanese forward units were able to organize any sort of real attack. During that night, elements of the 124th Infantry received considerable mortar, machine gun, and rifle fire from the east of the Drunamore. This fire increased the next morning, and at about noon, the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry, was attacked from the west by elements of the 237th Infantry. The first Japanese attack was, quote, finally broken up by a bayonet charge. And this was conducted by elements of the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry, but other attacks followed as troops of the 1st Battalion, 239th Infantry tried to move across the Drunamore River from the east, striking both the 124th Infantry's units and part of the 2nd Battalion, 169th Infantry. Before dark on the 22nd, the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry counted 155 new Japanese dead in their area. That unit and the 2nd Battalion, 169th Infantry reported their own losses as about 5 killed and 25 wounded. Despite further unsuccessful attempts to reopen the river crossing by the 1st Battalion, 239th Regiment, Adachi eventually decided on the 25th of July to dispatch the 41st Division south to reinforce the southern front. Following the fall of Afua, Hall directed Howie's battalions to depart from their East Branch base to reinforce Cunningham's South force, successfully arriving at the new defensive line by the 23rd. With these reinforcements in place, Cunningham, early in the afternoon on the same day, decided to deploy Troops A and B to advance west towards Troop C, while Howie's 2nd Battalion pushed southeast to support the isolated troop. Despite the lack of coordination in the attack, infantrymen managed to infiltrate Troop C's perimeter from the northwest, aiding in repelling a fierce Japanese assault from the southwest, while cavalrymen reclaimed Afua and established new defensive positions. Despite an initial triumph, American efforts to advance on July the 24th were thwarted by the resolute defenses of the Japanese, who fiercely guarded all paths, trails, and ridges in the densely forested terrain northeast of the perimeter. However, on the 25th, Companies E and B under Howe surprisingly made contact roughly 500 yards north of the besieged forces, encountering minimal resistance, which allowed the beleaguered Troop C to finally retreat. With Troop C relieved, Howe's units continued their assault southwards and westwards towards the Afua-Palaru Trail, driving the Japanese forces into the Torikeli Mountains. Nonetheless, a significant number of Japanese troops remained within a triangular area delineated by a sloping ground, Afua and Company G's ridgeline position, persistently harassing Cunningham's forces. Throughout the night, additional Japanese reinforcements, including the 66th Regiment, maneuvered behind Howe's 2nd Battalion, securing control over trails leading southeast through dense jungle from the Banana Patch to points on the Afua-Palaru Trail near the 2nd Battalion's command post. Consequently, on the 26th, Howe's 1st Battalion was withdrawn towards sloping grounds, while the 2nd Battalion expanded its positions to the east to cover the vacated area. On the 27th, the battalion launched a successful southwards attack. However, menacing Japanese movements to the west compelled the American forces to withdraw, despite other units under Cunningham also repelling enemy advances. Subsequently, Cunningham reorganized his lines on the 28th to strengthen his defenses, anticipating imminent large-scale Japanese assaults. On the 29th, the 1st Squadron and the 2nd Battalion renewed their offensive towards the south and west into the Triangle, yet this time Adachi's determined defenders successfully rebuffed them. Therefore, local patrol activity was the primary focus of the 30th and 31st, while Cunningham devised plans for another offensive into the Triangle. Major combat activity revolved around the withdrawal of Company G, the 127th Infantry, from its exposed outpost west of Afua. On the afternoon of the 29th, the unit had been driven more than 400 yards east of its original position by Japanese attacks and had established new defenses on some high ground about 300 yards west of Afua. On the 30th, the company was surrounded and spent all day fighting off a series of small-scale attacks. The next morning, it fought its way north to the dropping ground where it arrived at 1:30. Thence it moved on to the Drinamore River and joined the rest of the 2nd Battalion, 127th Infantry, which had switched positions with the 3rd. Now, during this period from the 13th to 31st of July, the South Force had suffered almost 1,000 casualties, of which 260 had been incurred by the 112th Cavalry. For the understrength cavalry regiment, this was a casualty rate over 17%. The 2nd Battalion, 127th Infantry had lost heavily and was in need of rest, reorganization, and re-equipment needs, which had prompted General Cunningham to change the places of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 127th Infantry. South Force casualties were as follows: 106 killed, 386 wounded, 18 missing, and 426 evacuated as a result of disease and sickness. South Force estimated that it had killed over 700 Japanese. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube and on all podcast platforms. Hey, maybe some of these episodes, like the one I just read, where we're talking about thousands of units moving to locations you've never heard of and can't even perceive because you don't have a map in front of you, maybe you'd like the podcasts I do over at my personal channel. They're less focused on the nitty-bitty and gritty bits like we do here on this week-by-week basis, and more on the stories and a firmer narrative, something more akin to what Dan Carlin does. I'm about to do another podcast with a co-host I have this weekend, and we're going to be touching upon underrated moments of World War II, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about how logistics win wars. If that seems interesting to you, please go check it out. And hell, if you want to check it out earlier than anybody else, you got to go over to my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, which is weeks in advance, by the way, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Speaking of which, I'm about to put up a poll today for what will be the next episode. If you join quickly, you can vote on it or give me a suggestion and I will probably do it. With the capture of Guam, the Marianas Campaign was finally over. Yet it seemed apparent to the frontline commanders the closer the island hopping got to the Japanese home islands, casualties were exponentially mounting. How much American blood was it going to take to end the Pacific War? That was a question the Japanese were pressing upon the Americans.